On Washington Unplugged, Congressmen Bobby Rush and Chris Smith. Our roundtable looks at nuclear North Korea and author Quinn Bradlee.
Hello, this is Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson, sitting in for Bob Schieffer. For 47 years, the United States has had an embargo with Cuba. This week, President Obama lifted some restrictions on the communist country. Cuban Americans who wish to travel to the island and send money home to their relatives can now do so more easily. U.S. telecommunications firms can also start making deals there. I'm here with New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith, who thinks this is not a good idea at all, and also Illinois Congressman Bobby Rush, who was in Cuba last week and met with the Castro brothers. Congressman Smith, I want to start with you. Your reaction to President Obama's...
Well, I actually voted or offered an amendment back in 2001 that it would have lifted the travel ban, but if and only if certain conditions were met, especially as it relates to release of the political prisoners and other human rights criteria. There should have been a serious negotiation, and at the conclusion of that, we would have gotten to the point where the travel ban was lifted. I'm concerned that exit permits given to Cubans to travel outside the country will only be limited to those men and women who silence themselves about human rights. That has been the practice years to date. And in terms of Cubans going into the country, if they're involved in any way with human rights advocacy or have relatives who are in prison, who are part of the pro-democracy movement, forget it. You're not going to get a visa from the Cuban government. They also, in Cuba, hold back the children. When people travel abroad, even now, the Cuban government says your kids stay behind as hostages. So only some Cubans will get there. Added to that, the remittances that are sent to Cuban families, about 20% of that money is stolen by the Cuban government. You talk about a fee, a tax, just for sending the money from, say, a relative in America to somewhere else on the island. 20% goes right into the coffers of the Castro brothers.
Congressman Rush, you were just there on this question of humanitarian rights and political prisoners. What can you tell us about your meeting with the Castros? There is reporting that this issue didn't even come up, that they weren't asked about this. What's your view on this?
Well, let me just say this. You know, I certainly have been an advocate for human rights all of my adult life. I mean, I was a product of the 60s and the civil rights movement. I've been involved in supporting human rights for the last 50, 60 years. So human rights issues are definitely in the forefront, in the center of what I do. However, I do believe that this is an issue that has been used to stymie the productive discussions. This is a new day. Human rights is on the table. Raul Castro issued a statement today where he said that everything was open for discussion. Everything is up for discussion. So let's begin to discuss these matters. I believe that what we need to do is, first of all, Cuba is not a terrorist state. It needs to come off the list of terrorist states. There's no rhyme nor reason for Cuba to be on the list of terrorist states.
But Congressman,
look, please let me finish. There are every nation in the world, noteworthy nation in the world, every nation in the world, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, all these nations have normal trade relationships with Cuba. Only the U.S.
Given your history with human rights and your attention to it, though, can you give us some assessment based on your visit about the conditions there? I know you want to look forward.
Our visit there was cut short because the president, the administration called and said that they needed the plane back. We did not go outside of Havana.
Okay.
So we didn't have a chance to meet with a number of organizations that we were scheduled to meet with.
Okay.
But, you know, notwithstanding that, you know, and let me just say this. As an African American, as an activist, as a person who once belonged to an organization that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI said was the #1 threat to national security, I'm not getting ready to buy into some of these arguments because I know I never was a threat.
Let me get Congressman Smith's reaction to what you said.
Well, John, first of all, I believe that if you look at the record, I have tried repeatedly, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, to get to Cuba, to get a visa from the Cuban government, and have been denied every time. We tried most recently in February. We were turned down flat. Why? Because we want to visit political prisoners, prisoners of conscience. There's a man named Artunez. He has spent 17 years in political prisons, has been tortured and mistreated. He's now out of prison. He has a hunger strike. And he and his group of human rights defenders are surrounded by secret police. I would make an appeal to the American media, to CBS in particular, respectfully. Tell the story of the dissidents. Dr. Oscar Bichette, an Afro-Cuban who was arrested in and out of prison 18 times in 2003 in a massive crackdown by the secret police in Cuba, got 25 years. He's a medical doctor. Many of us, including me, he's my adopted prisoner of conscience, believe that he may die. He has been so mistreated. And why does Bobby Rush, my good friend and colleague, why does Bobby Rush get into Cuba when people like myself, and I have a history, 29 years in Congress, of promoting human rights. I actually visited Perm Camp 35 in the Ural Mountains. Let me just say, all these years pushing human rights, anti-human trafficking, religious freedom. Here we have a situation where if we would just demand to go to these prison camps and argue for their release.
Let's let Congressman Rush, please respond, Congressman Rush.
There are nations in the world who has more and more flagrant violations of human rights. And we have normal trade relationships with them. Shall I remind you that Saudi Arabia has a vicious attitude toward women that's almost inhumane? May I remind you that China has a horrible human rights record? But we have normal trade relations. As a matter of fact, we're in our national debt. A significant portion of our national debt.
I would argue, and I take the point, Bobby.
We owe to China.
All right,
but here's the point.
Korea, here's the point. There are countries all across the world.
Here's the point.
Congressman Rush, let's have him
There
respond.
should be a lessons learned from our coddling of the dictatorship in China. They have gotten demonstrably worse. When Bill Clinton delinked human rights with trade and granted them unfettered MFN, most favored trading status, which is now called permanent normal trading relationship, and that was carried on by the Bush administration as well. We just threw in the towel and said human rights are a footnote. Recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was actually in Beijing, and while she was there or on her way, she said human rights will not distract. It will not be, get in the way of selling treasury bonds. We have unfortunately put human rights somewhere in the back pages.
In this case,
I would argue, John, let me finish. I would argue to Bobby that just because we have been grossly inconsistent when it comes to China or when it comes to Saudi Arabia, which practices gross human rights, especially in the area of religious freedom, it seems to me where we have a policy where we try to hold to account the Castro brothers, I would argue that they ought to be indicted and held to account.
As it relates to religious freedom, let me just remind you that I am an ordained minister, a pastor of a church, and on Palm Sunday, I preached at a church in Havana. There was no restrictions of human rights there or religious freedom there. The people came and they freely, they were like, they could have been in any church in America. Let me also remind you that still today there are some U.S. prisoners, some prisoners in America who were activists during the 60s, who are political prisoners, who are still languishing in American jails.
All right, Congressman Rush, that's going to have to be it, I'm afraid. Congressman Rush, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Smith, thank you very much for being with us. You're watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com. On Tuesday, North Korea announced that in response to a United Nations rebuke over its recent missile launch, it will kick out UN inspectors, pull out of nuclear disarmament talks, and go forward with its nuclear program. Here to talk about this is David Asher, who was a senior advisor to the Bush State Department involved deeply in the issue of North Korea, and New York Times chief Washington correspondent David Sanger. He is in the New York bureau of the Times, and he's also the author of The Inheritance, a book about the world Barack Obama inherits, including the tricky problem of North Korea. David Asher, I want to start with you. These recent developments from North Korea, put them in some context, because North Korea is kind of a tricky country. We don't know quite what to make of it, yet it is a serious problem.
Well, we always say history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes with North Korea. Mark Twain coined that phrase, and it really applies. They've repeated the same playbook of engagement followed by a sort of predatory escalation, followed by a degree of engagement in the context of always trying to extract the maximum amount of financial benefits and global attention possible. So in some ways they're having a tantrum. And it's not at all uncharacteristic. It's a very rational policy that they've had, a strategy that they've had going back to the early 90s, and it's consistently paid off. the question here is, will it be any different than in the past?
David Sanger, what does your reporting tell you about the way the Obama folks see North Korea compared to the way the Bush administration saw it, and what are they trying to do to deal with this cycle of tantrum and misbehavior by North Korea?
Well, I think the first thing that they've done differently here, John, is they've basically decided to plan for and ignore the tantrums, something anybody with kids would appreciate, right? So you have not heard President Obama shoot back in any particular way, talk very much about the North Koreans. In fact, when they appointed a North Korea coordinator to play the role that Chris Hill played in those six-party talks that played out for so many years in the Bush second term, they hired Steve Bosworth, who's a former American ambassador to South Korea, and he's doing it as a part-time job. He's remaining as dean of a school while he's doing it. I think that tells you everything you need to know about how they plan to do this, which is try to contain the problem but not invest heavily in it. There is a risk in that, John, and it's this. It's not that North Korea will shoot a missile at the United States or at Japan or at South Korea. The big problem with North Korea has always been a proliferation problem. That reactor in Syria the Israelis bombed 2 years ago, it was North Korean. There have been other cases like this. So the big fear is, how do you stop the shipments?
So, David, what's your view of the way the Obama administration is approaching this? And also, can you talk to me a little bit about what actually works and what doesn't work with North Korea in terms of getting them to do what the U.S. wants?
Well, I think the Obama strategy is pretty intelligent. I agree with David on that. It's a certain degree of distance and discipline. They're not over-promising North Korea in any way. I think they have sincerely put forward a willingness to negotiate, including bilaterally, at the appropriate level and at the appropriate time, but under appropriate conditions. I mean, I think they'll talk to them under any conditions, essentially. We always felt that when I was at the Powell State Department there was nothing wrong with it, but you, at the same time, have to, be wary of the North Koreans trying to get you into a trap, which they've done repeatedly, of making the process more important than the outcome. So I think that they're doing a pretty intelligent job over at the Clinton State Department. The problem, as David points out right now, is proliferation. Right. This was a major part of my work at the National Security Council at the State Department. We put forward many plans to more effectively counter North Korean proliferation. We could never get them approved. The result was, as David points out, this reactor in Syria that we had known about and pursued without result.
Is that fixed through talking, though?
No, that's not. I don't think there's a chance that the negotiations will have any impact on the proliferation activity. The Syria reactor program began back in the 90s under the nuclear talks that the Clinton administration had under the agreed framework, four-party talks at the time. Their cooperation with the AQ-CON network, of which that is probably a manifestation, was active at that period. Same thing happened under us. They were proliferating the entire time we were negotiating, and it's what we don't know about. For example, with Iran, that I think is particularly concerning, particularly at this time.
So David Sanger, the last question then goes to you, which is what actually effectively can be done on the question of proliferation, and then piggybacking on that, to talk a little bit about Russia and China. How can they be helpful here on this proliferation question?
John, the United Nations Security Council passed a presidential statement, which is weaker than a Security Council resolution, just over the weekend. I guess on Monday it passed through and led to this North Korean reaction. And it called for full enforcement of the last set of sanctions that were placed on North Korea after North Korea conducted its nuclear test in the fall of 2006. If you read through those sanctions, it lays out a possibility of what the U.S. and its allies could do. It actually authorizes member states to go intercept, board, and inspect North Korean shipping in and out of the country to make sure there are no banned materials or weapons. After the U.S. pressed for this additional resolution a few days ago, I asked the question, so we're now planning to go board and intercept the shipping? And they said, oh, no, we didn't say that. So I think one thing you should look for is whether or not President Obama has a real plan to go try to interfere with this system. The pressure against doing that is going to come from Russia and China. The Chinese are interested primarily in making sure that North Korea is stable, that it doesn't collapse, because those refugees, if the state does collapse, are coming right over the Chinese border. And the Russians, again, just want it to be calm. Neither one of them wants to see North Korea expand its nuclear arsenal, but they are not willing, I think, to go the extra mile that could threaten the stability of Kim Jong-il's regime.
Okay. Thanks very much, David Sanger. David Asher, thanks very much for being with us. You're watching
Thank
Washington
you.
Unplugged on CBSNews.com. Welcome back to Washington Unplugged. I'm sitting here with Quinn Bradlee, the son of former Washington Post editor Ben Bradlee and author Sally Quinn. He just wrote a book titled A Different Life, which is the story of his life with a syndrome called Velocardiofascial syndrome. Quinn, tell me about the book and why you decided to write it.
Well, the name of the syndrome is Velocardiofascial syndrome.
All right.
Don't worry about it.
And but it's known as VCFS, for those who mispronounce it like me.
Yes, and a lot of people do because nobody knows about it, and it's so weird because, like you said, it's the second most common syndrome after Down syndrome, and you would think people would know something like that, but they just have no idea that it's out there.
And that's part of what the book's about, isn't it? For a long time, you were going through medical procedure after medical procedure because it affects your heart, your throat, your speech, all these different pieces, and people didn't know, so for a long time you were in the dark about this, right?
Yeah, there's people, I get emails all the time saying, we spent, just like you and your parents, 14 years on going to doctor, and they don't know what's wrong with it. They think there's, he's epileptic, and he's not. And, and then there's Dr. Robert Sprenchen of Syracuse, New York. And he has saved everybody's life. Because all these people email me, what can I do? And I had to say, well, just go to Dr. Robert Sprenchen. He's the expert on this.
Tell me about how tough it was during this period where you were going through the physical, the emotional problems, you had learning disabilities, and what that was like at school. How bad did it get?
Well, when people think of, LD, they think of dyslexia. They think of one thing, but what they don't understand is LD is a tree of learning disabilities. It's not just one thing. There's dysgraphia, dyscalculia. It just goes on and on and on.
Right.
And VCFS, what's different about VCFS and dyslexia is that it causes the medical problems as well as learning disabilities.
Right, and so when you were younger, and other kids can be cruel and brutal, and how tough did it get going through all of this?
It can be pretty tough because you start to wonder. You think everything you do is normal because you don't know any better, and then you go to a special school for kids who have learning disabilities, and yet you see other kids teasing other kids with learning disabilities, and you're at a special school, and you just go, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I think the reason why kids tease other kids is because they will see that, if they tease other kids, then people will say, oh, well, he's teasing me, so he doesn't have it. They do it to hide their, learning disabilities.
Right, right. And then you grew up in this special atmosphere in Washington with two parents who are very powerful, well-known, throw a lot of parties. What was that like growing up? Because one of the elements of this syndrome is there's a social aspect to it in terms of recognizing social cues. And so what was it like growing up with that in Washington?
Well, I think one of the reasons why I have trouble reading social cues is because I was raised by adults. I didn't have any, friends my own age, really. And so I think, how adults interact with each other is totally different than how kids interact with each other. And so I think I was used to how, adults interact with each other. And so my mom's friends, which also led me to be attracted to older women as well. And, because all my mom's girlfriends would come over and they were all these hot older women. And, to me, that's what's beautiful. And it was a different life growing up.
Right. And you and I share something, which is that we're often introduced by our parents first, and people hear about them first. So in some ways, is this book you're, stepping out of that special life you grew up in?
Yeah, I think, I've always, since day one, I've been in my mother's arms, and I've never really left until now. And as I describe it, I feel, we all go off into the wooded forest, sometimes and leave our mother's nest. But with me, I'm going off into the wooded forest with a broken leg or something.
Right,
and
right.
I feel like I've been raised as, this zoo animal, and for the first time being released into the wilderness, sitting there, asking, all right, now what do I do?
Right, right. Well, you've got a great book here, and you've also got friendsofquinn.com,
Yes.
which is a website and a social networking site to help kids with learning disabilities so that they're not left in the dark the way you were growing up. So it's really great, and it's been great to have you, Quinn. I really appreciate it. Thanks for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
You're watching Washington Unplugged on CBSNews.com.